I get that right, Flint? All right. Flint spent a couple of years in Germany, so he's better at his German. Resistance nest is what we call them. Those were the heaviest fortified areas behind the beaches. So I have obstacles on the beaches, which you'll see in just a moment, and then you have these heavily fortified resistance nests. Anywhere from 2 to 4 of those on each one of the draws. Again, the primary areas that we have to get inland on. Okay, so this is what that actually looked like. Where's that pointer that you had, Mike?
Right behind you.
Right behind me? Ah, there we go. All right, so I can reach all the way across. So these are what they look like, okay? These are each one of those, the draws, okay? And you can see by just sort of looking at this on a three-dimensional basis how steep this area looks. So obviously down here is the beach. You see obstacles along the beach. Along here is the shingle, and I'll have some other things to show you on that as well, so you can kind of get a sense for how that looked. This is really a good view of what Omaha Beach looks like. We landed at low tide. We intentionally chose to land at low tide. The reason for that, and again, I'll have more photos of that in just a moment, is all of the beach obstacles were in this area. We wanted to expose those obstacles in advance of the invasion so that we didn't have our landing craft getting hung up on these various kinds of obstacles, many of which had mines on top of them, which meant that those landing craft would have been exploded if they hit one of those mines, or at a minimum got hung up on those mines as well, or hung up on those as well. And you can really see the sort of crescent view of the beach in this particular photo as well. This is what it looks like from the other side. So if I'm up on top of the bluffs or the cliffs, looking down on Omaha Beach. I point this out, and the grass was real heavy like this, long, thick, dense. It'll come into play. Oh, and by the way, in the forefront of that were hedgehogs, which you also see right here. Those were anti-tank obstacles. This is the shingle. This is the area furthest away. So if you're going across that sandy beach, when you get all the way across to that, there's a little bit of a seawall, and you have this shingle, which you can see is made up of smooth stones. Provided some degree of cover once our troops actually crossed that. And by the way, at low tide, I think it was in that earlier slide, 300 to 400 yards wide. So it's incredibly important in terms of our pre-invasion objectives to be able to do something with that. Otherwise, our guys are just crossing 300 to 400 yards. By the way, they've just been in landing craft for hours potentially. A lot of them are seasick, they're wet, they're carrying a lot of equipment. So they've got a long way to go before they even get to this to have any degree of cover other than the obstacles that the Germans actually had put out there. This is what it looked like from the landing craft coming in. This really does a good job, I think, of showing those cliffs, just how high they are above where these guys are landing, okay? This is what it looked like from the Germans' perspective, looking back down on them. And here now you can see these different obstacles. So those are those hedgehogs. We'll see them again in another one. Some of these poles. A lot of times these individual poles like this would have a mine on top of them. These are Belgian gates down here. Those are anti-tank. These are anti-tank as well. So here's a closer up view of, here's the Belgian gate. Here are those poles that I was referring to, often with mines on them. These were another obstacles that would have, in some cases, multiple mines. These would hang up, obviously, landing craft coming in and catching on them if you were landing with the tide further up. You could literally land on one of these things, get caught, and then obviously explode. This is the hedgehog. Again, it's more of an anti-tank thing. Here you can see 300 to 400 yards at low tide, which is where we were landing. About 6:30 in the morning is when the invasion started. And see how far out these obstacles go. Here's that shingle that I was talking about a moment ago. Then it kind of flattens out momentarily. You have the concertina or barbed wire. across in this area, and mines a lot of cases in this area, and then these cliffs.
David, what's the difference between high and low tide average there?
You mean in terms of the depth? Oh, actually, that's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I'll have to read.
High tide listed right there, it shows you where high tide goes right up to the shingle.
Well, you mean in terms of how far it came in? Is that really your question?
I'm talking about depth.
Yeah. No, I don't. So this is what you're talking about, really, from here, this depth. I don't know what that is, actually. I'll have to look that up. That's a good question. It does come all the way up to here as it comes in, and it actually does come in fairly quickly. So when they get to this shingle, by the time the tide is all the way up, there isn't a whole lot behind them that isn't covered with water. Yes, sir.
What time of day was high tide?
What time was high tide? I will have to get that too. I'm sorry, I don't know
I'm
that.
just wondering how much time, about 12 hours. Probably about 12 hours.
You know, Flint, by chance? No? Okay.
It was 6 in the morning. It was
6:30 is when the first troops started landing. Again, this is sort of a view of what it looks like more, again, sort of on a three-dimensional basis. So they'd come in here, like I said, and if this was be at low tide because all this is exposed down here, the ramp. Here's the shingle up here, concertina wire, and then those resistance nests would be up above that. So you had two layers really of defense. You have the beach obstacles, and then you have the resistance nests above those. This is an area that shows you the different Let's see, I got to get back out here where I can see a little bit better. Oh, here we go. So here are the different resistance nests. See, this one's actually got two out here on front and then two further up in the draw. The rest of them have at least two around each one of the draws.
Now, what's in the resistance nest?
So you would have anything from typically some sort of a heavy gun, anywhere from 75, 88. I think there are even some 150s, I believe it was. And then you would typically have supporting around that. You could have mortar pits around that. You would have machine guns in those as well. You'd have snipers and then just normal infantry with other small arms. They weren't actually huge numbers of men manning each one of those resistance nests, but obviously they were still extremely formidable and well defended around it. The areas between the resistance nests actually ended up being the areas where the guys would ultimately start making their breakthroughs. The ones who landed immediately in front of a draw, where you have all this support, those are the ones who really took terrible casualties.
David, the tidal range is 20 feet.
Thank you. Don't you love the internet?
That's a lot.
Yeah. This is an example, and these next couple of slides, and I don't go through all the different ones I have, but this is an example of what some of those resistance nests look. You can see that they're very heavily fortified with reinforced concrete that's feet thick. You didn't have to destroy the complete resistance nest or this fortification in order to succeed in taking it. A lot of times the accuracy of the naval gunfire was enough that you could get shots through, obviously, the openings to their guns and destroy, obviously, either the troops in there, sometimes explode the magazines that were in there, and take them out of commission in that fashion. So this is a modern day photo. So this is what you would still see if you were to go there today. Likewise, this is another example, and you can see just how huge these things are. So again, going to somebody's question here a moment ago, around these in many cases, like I said, you would have trenches that the troops could move throughout, and they were deep enough that only basically their head and maybe a little bit of their shoulders would be above it. They could have machine guns, they could be snipers, they could have other kinds of small arms. Sometimes you'd have mortar pits. So a lot of the mortar pits, maybe some of them are further back. All these are, by the way, pre-sighted, which means that the entire beach area that we're talking about, they knew exactly what it took to fire on it. So if someone a spotter was saying, fire on this particular grid, they could fire across, in most cases, the length of the beach in terms of these heavy guns or a mortar and put it put the shells exactly where they needed to based on where the troops were. Where was it? Oh, sorry, yes, sir.
Yeah, it appears that that the Germans spent quite a bit of time building these defenses. How far in advance do you think they anticipated us landing there?
Actually, I think the earliest of that was in terms of Hitler, and it was, I think Hitler was kind of the guy that was behind it. I think 41 or 42 they started,
Yeah, okay.
and they were continuing to do that. Now Rommel took over the defenses. I want to say that was sometime in 43, late 43, early 44, and decided that they were inadequate in many ways. And one of the things that he really wanted to beef up were the mines that they had here, because they didn't have time to build a lot more of these. But he wanted to put a lot more beach obstacles. His feeling was that they needed to stop the invasion at the beach.
Yeah. Well, Hitler thought that we were going to attack across the short part.
Yeah, at the point of Calais.
Rommel wasn't able to convince him that, I mean, Rommel believed that we were going to attack around Normandy, and he could not convince Hitler of that, so Hitler kept more of his defenses up north. You know, I mean, it was bad enough as it was, but had they come, you know, had he had more defenses, it would have been a lot worse.
Well, not to spend a lot of time doing that, but the Allies actually spent a lot of time on a deception plan that continued even after the invasion, trying to convince the Germans that the Pas-de-Calais was going to be, which is the shortest distance from England over to the French coast. It's only, that's where people, if you're going to swim the English Channel, so 20, 25 miles, something like that, across that area, which was the closest. That was the most heavily defended area that the Germans had over there, correct. And we spent a lot of effort, like I say, convincing the Germans that's where we're going to land. It actually held up the use of panzers who were behind the beach area being sent to the beach, because we continued to basically spin that lie even after the invasion had begun, that this was just a feint, meaning the Normandy invasion. If you're not familiar with the term feint, it basically means I'm going to attack over here, but I'm really going to attack over here. And so this is the feint, okay? And that's what they managed to convince them for a long time, even after the invasion began. So they held up sending forces to defend or to reinforce the Normandy area. Yeah, there you go. And Garbo was the spy who was kind of behind that. Fascinating story. Somebody should do a talk on that someday. Okay. So what did the Allies plan to do in advance of the invasion to support it, to help these guys? Remember, get across the 300 to 400 yards that we had in there. So the first part of it was an aerial bombardment, and the idea was they're going to drop bombs on the beach and pockmark it, creating areas that the guys, while they're crossing this, could actually get in these pockmarks, these holes, right, on the beach as they're crossing it, so that they're not just an open target the entire 300 to 400 yards that they're going across it. Defilade. What actually happened? Well, they flew the mission perpendicular to the beach. So remember, it's kind of a crescent like this. They flew the mission like this. They postponed the mission, or the Normandy invasion, by 1 day, from the 5th to the 6th, because of terrible weather on the 5th. The weather was better on the 6th, but hardly what you would characterize as great weather still. But Eisenhower decided to go anyway. So you did have some cloud cover, you had rough seas, and one of the things we learned from the invasion of Sicily was that we needed to make sure that we try to do everything we can to avoid friendly fire. Now, if any of you have ever seen any documentaries on D-Day, you've noticed that all of the planes had black and white stripes on their wings, sometimes on their fuselage as well. So that Navy guns, which is what happened off Sicily, where we had literally naval guns, sorry Army, who fired on the 82nd Airborne and killed some of our own men, created some substantial casualties. So they wanted to avoid that on this one. So these guys drop perpendicular to the beach. They want to make sure that they don't hit any of the naval craft that's out in the water, just the opposite, right? The Air Force bombing the Navy in this case. So they drop perpendicular, but they also told them, hold dropping for a few more seconds. Well, anybody that's in Air Force knows exactly what's going to happen from that, right? The bombs drop long. They drop on top of the bluffs. They don't hit the beaches. They don't pockmark the beaches. And so it's a failure by the Air Force. Personal opinion, and by the way, this is something that I've gotten out of the National Archives. The Air Force actually, or Army Air Corps at that point in time, recognizes the fact that they didn't succeed in doing this. The reason that they didn't fly it parallel, which is the way I believe they should have flown it, in other words, along with the beach, is because they would have been subjected to longer German anti-aircraft fire had they flown that way. I get it, but by the same token, look at the sacrifices that the guys on the ground made as a result of you missing the mark completely. It was completely ineffective. Next phase, naval bombardment. So the Navy in pre-invasion, so we're talking in the area of around 550 to around 630, naval guns. You had two battleships, the Arkansas and the Texas. You had 3 cruisers. I think they were 2 British, I want to say, and 1 French maybe. Anyway, and then the Navy, those destroyers, that were all firing on pre-designated targets. In other words, targets obviously that they had gotten the intelligence on, knew where they were, and so they were going to fire on those. They did that for about 40 minutes. Remember the grass that I was telling you about a little while ago? So I start firing. By the way, again, the weather conditions aren't optimal. Still have some cloud cover. But as soon as we start firing on those targets, what happens is we're starting to kick up dust and sand, and we ignite that grass, and it starts burning. And so we've got smoke as well. And so what it does very quickly is obscure those targets, and we're only firing on them for 40 minutes anyway. Guess what? The naval gunfire, completely ineffective. Pre-invasion. Okay, next one. We had specially designed LCT, there were LCTRs, I'll show you a picture in just a second, of a rocket a barrage that we were also going to fire on the beaches to try to take out some of those obstacles, and again also provide some pockmarking of the beaches to help the troops. So this is what those vessels look like. They would literally have in the neighborhood of slightly over 1,000 rockets that were firing off of these ships. But as you can imagine, with the technology that existed back in the 1940s or whatever, these weren't super accurate, and literally you're almost sort of the navigator of those LCTRs was just trying to kind of align the ship as best he could with those beaches. And remember, the beaches, again, crescent shape, right? So what happens? They fall, oh, let me go back. They fall short. They land in the surf. They don't land on the beach. Again, failure number 3. We're not helping out those troops. Pre-invasion plan number 4, tanks. So we're going to actually, and obviously the Germans thought, remember I showed you a couple of the Hedgehogs and the Belgian Gates, those were designed to stop tanks. And so there was anticipation by the Germans that we actually could bring tanks ashore from the water. So they're going to provide some artillery support for our lightly armed troops that just have small arms. We have 2 types of tanks mostly, or the most common anyway, that we were using on that day. The first one there in the upper left is called a DD tank. And believe it or not, even though this thing weighs almost 30 tons, they actually found a way to make this thing swim. They had little propellers that were on the back. They could do about 5 knots in optimal conditions. The skirt, let me borrow my pointer again. This is a canvas skirt that I'm sure obviously was treated somehow. And so this thing would actually pull clear up like this. And so if you're actually a German looking at this thing coming in from the water, it actually would look a lot like a landing craft to you. You would barely even be able to tell the difference until it really got on shore. Once it got on shore, it would drop its skirt, and it would look like this, okay? The other one, and this one would get landed much closer to shore, but still within water, And so the idea behind these two things, these are called snorkels, is to allow it to, or keep the tank from flooding out its engine by having this. And so these would be landed by LCTs, but they would be still landed in water deep enough that you would need these snorkels on them. Okay, so this is what happened to part of the tanks that came ashore. And if any of you are familiar with this, you've probably heard this. By the way, there were 96 tanks that were intended for the Omaha Beach area. So the 741st, those four companies, 27 of the tanks, of the 32, the original 32 that were sent, they were sent too far off. Normally these things are, the way they were tested was in, generally speaking, calmer water and not nearly as far out. Some of these tanks were launched, I believe, as far as 6 miles away from the shore. Yeah. And the water, and why anybody ever gave the order to send them from that distance, I have no idea. They're intended to be more a mile or two type of thing. And as I said, again, remember the weather, hardly optimal for the invasion. Good enough to go, but hardly optimal. And so the seas, and maybe they were worse, because by the way, they use these kinds of tanks, some British versions as well on their Cromwell tanks, on the other invasion beaches, and they didn't have anything like these kinds of losses that we see here. So anyway, many of them sunk almost immediately after they were launched because the seas were apparently rough enough. They did manage to get a few, obviously ashore, 5 in this particular case out of that group of 32. By the end of the day, the 741st only had 3 of its 48 tanks that were still operational.
You have a number of personnel that were lost in the tank?
You know, I actually looked that up. I don't have a specific number, but I did look that up. The losses weren't that bad, actually. A lot of the guys managed to apparently get out of the tanks, and there were enough other naval craft in the area that most of them got picked up. So it wasn't as bad as what it could have been, certainly. The 743rd did much better. They all, however, they came ashore on LCTs. Now, admittedly, you know, so the invasion's going full bore at this point in time. These things are coming under attack, and as you can see, Company B lost a lot of its tanks in front of the was Veerville, right? Yeah, Veerville draw. The other ones were landed more in the neighborhood of Dog Green, Easy Green, Easy Red, and Fox Green. They did far better. By the end of the first day, they still had 38 of their original 48 that were operational. And we did have some successes. These 3 guys, I need to change my picture there a little bit, sorry about that. You can see that they were capable, or were able to knock out some of the guns. By the way, just a real quick point on that first one, the French 75 millimeter, you're wondering maybe why are the Germans using French 75 millimeter? So in the early part of the war, the invasion of France in 1940, they overran, obviously, the French very quickly, and I don't know where exactly those guns were captured, but the Germans, like the Japanese, by the way, in the Pacific, like in Hong Kong and Singapore, when they overran those positions and the guns were still in great shape, the shells were still in great shape, they used those against the Allies later in the war. So you've got, in this particular case, a German crew using a French 75 millimeter gun as one of the primary guns on the Omaha Beach sector. Got another guy knocking one out, a 75, or what he thought was maybe an 88 millimeter gun down there, and then finally Sergeant Reagan's tanks, DD tank, claims credit for taking out a German mortar. So there were some successes by the tanks that were able to get ashore in taking out German positions. Okay, so let's get to the 9 U.S. destroyers. They were all pretty modern destroyers. They were this Cleves class destroyer, 1,600 tons, about a football length in length, 240 roughly men in terms of officers and men. Its primary armament were its 4 5-inch guns, biggest, 40 millimeter, 20 millimeter, and then it obviously had the ability to launch torpedoes. They took up firing positions once they were sent in to provide firing support as close to 500 yards, damn near point blank range. And as you can see, in some cases, only around 12 to 18 feet of water underneath them. So they're almost scraping bottom. Fired on targets all the way from Point du Hoc. Yeah, I'm going to do that here in a minute. From Point du Hoc to Fort and Benson. Let's see. Do I want to look at this? Actually, let's do this. So let me switch over here for a second.
You have tape on the back, so you.
Oh, okay, good. I'm going to get oriented here a little bit. Wow, okay. Let's put this up. So this is a map that I put together. And I know that all this is going to be too small for you to be able to read from where you're sitting, unless maybe you're right up here in the front. But let me give you some. So this is Omaha Beach. This is that crescent that we're talking about. Gold is over here. That's one of the British beaches. Here's Port and Benson that I was just talking about a moment ago. And here's Point du Hoc up here. This is where the Rangers landed. All these are the beaches. So this Able, Baker, Charlie, Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, Easy Green, Easy Red, Fox Green, Fox Red. Port and Benson, okay? This is north. So the beaches, this is east. Obviously, this is west, south, north. England's up here, okay? So all of these are color-coded to represent the 9 destroyers that I'm going to be talking about. And this gives you some sort of a sense for where they were firing. This is in no way telling you these are all of the individual areas that they hit, but this gives you a sense for where they were firing across all these areas. Down here at Point du Hoc, if I were to put them in here in terms of this whole area would be purple by the USS Satterley, okay? So that's kind of our, give you a little bit of sense for where these guys, so when I'm saying Point du Hoc over here to Port and Benson, they're literally firing the length and width of this. Okay, about 8:30, so 2 hours into the invasion, Omar Bradley, who is in charge of all the American troops at not just Omaha, but Utah and the airborne troops that landed to the west and south, I guess it would be, of Utah. He is so concerned with the way the landings are going at this point in time that he considers attempting to withdraw the troops that are there already. And you can only imagine if it's that bad, how many of those guys would have ever gotten off the beach, especially anybody who was wounded. They would have probably virtually all been destroyed, anybody that was up there already, taken prisoner or died on the beach. All of the rest of the troops who still haven't landed on Omaha, because there's wave after wave after wave that are supposed to be going in, they would have been sent to British beaches instead. That's how bad it was at 8:30, 2 hours into the invasion. Now, what was the plan for how the Navy was going to operate with the Army in terms of calling in fire support? They had practiced. There was the assumption that obviously, because you don't immediately you're the weakest position you're in when you're first invading, because you have no heavy equipment, no heavy arms, artillery, howitzers, those kinds of things, other than those tanks that we were just talking about, when you first are coming ashore. And so the expectation was that we're going to have to provide fire support from the Navy. So we had shore fire control parties that were comprised of an officer from the Navy, an officer from the Army, and then a radio team. They were supposed to communicate back and forth from the beach. Okay, they're essentially the, what's the term? Forward spotter. Thank you. Forward spotter. Forward observer. There we go. Forward observer on the beach to call in out to the radio or out to the Navy and say, here's where I need you to put fire. Here's where I have defenses that I need you to help me take out because I don't have the equipment on shore to be able to do that, okay? So they had trained in advance of the invasion to provide that kind of fire support assistance. This is what it should have looked like. This is an example of the Satterlee. The Satterlee is the ship that's over here off of Point du Hoc providing fire support for the Rangers on top of Point du Hoc. This is just one example. And do I have anybody who's a forward observer? Anybody have that experience? You do? Okay. So this is the kind of stuff. So you would be saying, I need and this is a pre-designated target here, so number 88, I need fire support on target 88. So that would have been pre-designated on a map that both the Army and the Navy had. Because by the way, the Army would also use these same kinds of maps that the Navy's going to use to fire on to actually do movement once they're ashore. So in other words, I could say, I need you to reconnoiter to a particular location, whether it's this target or some other 6-digit code that I'm going to show you in a moment. So they were used by both sides. So I need firing on this. And so what you would do then initially, the Navy, once they got this call, is that they would fire on that target. Then the forward observer would say, adjust. Forward, back, right, left. They'd fire another round. Adjust, forward, right, left, back. Fire for effect, essentially. Then you saturate the area. Then you move on to the next target if you've destroyed it at that point in time. So this is just one example. This went on until late in the evening on Point du Hoc. I have hundreds of entries like this. That's the way it was supposed to be. Here's another example. This is that 6-digit code that I was referring to. So that grid map that I was referring to would literally have an X and Y axis, 2-digit code across the top, 2-digit code across the left, horizontally and vertically, and then additional, based on what I've heard from Mike, codes that would be even finer gradation inside the map itself. So in other words, within the map, this area. And in other words, I would have codes across this way, and then additional levels of 2 digits of codes here to even get a finer gradation. So the USS Satterlee fired at German defenses from 7:30 until 1906 when it was relieved by the Thompson. Fired like what I was just showing you on those kinds of coordinates, because they maintained constant radio contact with the Rangers on top of Point du Hoc. This is an example of the things, and I'm going to show you this for each one of them, the kinds of things that they're going. So pillboxes, anti-tank guns, machine gun pits, German troops, bivouac areas, roads and road junctions. Fired a total of 1,524 rounds. Just the Satterlee.
In 12 hours.
Yes. Targets of opportunity. Unfortunately, that's not the way it went for the majority of Omaha Beach. So we ended up firing on targets of opportunity. When communication broke down, and apparently in many, many cases, either the troops that were designated as the shore fire control parties, either they were wounded, they were killed, or their radios malfunctioned as a result of all the salt water maybe that they got as they were coming into the beaches in the first places. But they didn't have communication. It was extremely spotty in all the other areas except Point du Hoc. So they would rely on, with guys on binoculars on the ships, and so that's how the firing ended up taking place. So Baldwin started firing on targets at about a little after 8 o'clock in the morning. Counter battery, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it basically means that if I'm being fired on, and the destroyers did get fired on by Germans, there was only one ship that took minor damage and was able to repair it very quickly. So they were very fortunate and didn't actually take any serious hits from any of the German artillery. Attempted to contact the shore fire control party, were unsuccessful doing that. Get a sense for just a couple of examples. 1025 fired down Port Inbenson, 64 rounds of 5-inch. Below that, target 38, again a pre-designated target, 22 rounds of 5, 176 rounds of 40 millimeter. And so you're seeing they're really saturating some of these targets. Baldwin altogether fired at German defenses from about 11 to 2230. Those 4 different sectors, and so it was doing cruising back and forth across multiple sectors rather than like the Satterley that just stayed off of Point de Hoc. Again, you can kind of get a sense for all the different types of targets that they were firing on. A total, again, of 1,495 rounds of ammunition that were fired. Carmack. So this was one of the other interesting aspects of this firing on, or targets of opportunity, where we could actually add a component to help, so to speak, firing with greater accuracy rather than simply going on the basis of what we can see with our binoculars. So a degree of what was referred to as silent cooperations began to take place between the Carmack and a tank, one of the tanks that did make it ashore, that was firing on various targets, in this particular case on the veer-wheel draw, wherein the tank would fire on a position. So the guys are on the ship, they're observing what's happening out there, and they're seeing this tank firing on something. Okay, they know what it is. There's my forward observer, can't talk to him otherwise, I'm going to fire. Tank sees the fire that comes across from the destroyer, opens the lid, the hatch to the top of his tank, takes a look back and see, destroyer just fired on that target. Let's see if we can't keep this thing going. So he fires on additional targets, and the destroyer follows suit and fires on the same targets, and they just keep taking them out. And it wasn't limited to just the tanks. They started noticing that the infantry was firing on various targets, and so they would start firing on those targets as well. So this silent cooperation continued throughout the day using both tanks and infantry. What are they shooting at? They must be shooting at it for some reason. Let's follow suit.
Smoke must have cleared up quite a bit.
It did, because you did have a breeze that was blowing, and if I remember correctly, it was blowing in the direction that was blowing the smoke inland, if I remember correctly. Flint's shaking his head, yes. Carmack, obviously, really busy. It was all over, all along the beach, hitting basically every sector that you can. Again, you can, so there's a list of the different things that they were firing at. 1,127 rounds, all 5-inch. So they were going after typically larger targets. Okay, the Doyle. So I'm going to give you kind of a quick rundown on each one of them. Again, you can see how long they were firing. All the way from 7, a little after, not quite 7:30, all the way until 2100. Again, Doyle was going across, obviously, a substantial part of the beach. Counter battery, machine guns, infantry, casemates, gun emplacements, 714 rounds of 5-inch. Emmons fired at German defenders on Fox Green, Fox Red, and Port Benson. I don't know whether you've been noticing at the top the number of targets that I've included, but some of them I think were like 24, 25 targets. Obviously this one a fewer number. They're firing a lot more heavily because just 7 targets and they fired almost 1,900 rounds. Franklin was the flagship for these 9 destroyers. It was cruising back and forth the entire length of this. They were apparently involved with a lot more conversation back and forth between the ships and didn't fire as much themselves. Still, they were firing on 4 different beaches, 13 different targets, a lot of pillboxes, as you can see, a lot of machine guns. The machine guns were the things that were really reaping havoc, especially in certain sectors where they were landing directly in front of draws that were taking down a huge number of our guys, unfortunately. Frankfurt only fired, by comparison to the other ones, only 343 rounds, again, all 5-inch. The McCook, again, you can see the vast majority of these destroyers were firing almost the entire length of the day. I mean, it just, I think about 2,200 is about as late as it was. Yeah, that's 10 o'clock at night. Okay. huge variety of targets that the McCook was firing on, 21 different targets. Even you can see a rocket launcher up there, houses, churches and steeples a lot of times would have been like high points, obviously, for the Germans. Snipers in those areas as well, but typically they're more spotters. And so there were a number of churches that were fired on and the steeples taken out because they were spotting areas for the Germans. 930 rounds of 5-inch. Thompson was the one that took over ultimately for the Satterlee when it ran so low on ammunition. By the way, do we have anybody that was on a destroyer? No? Okay. Huge numbers. I mean, typically they wouldn't want to get to the point where I think it was below about 20 or 30% of their total available ammunition that they would want to fire below. Clearly on some of those where they were up there around 1,500, almost 1,900 rounds, they would have been firing virtually everything that they had, at least in terms of. Thompson fired on 18 targets. Again, you can see the incredible variety of targets that they're going after. A lot of fortified houses, a lot of stone houses, stone walls. I mean, the Germans were just everywhere. Another one down there, 320 millimeter rocket launcher, 762 rounds of 5-inch. This is what the entire, it looked like for all 9 destroyers in total. So 164 different targets, 9,240 rounds. About 2/3 of them were 5-inch. Again, by the way of color coding, if you want to reference back over here, all the colors that I have in this particular spreadsheet match up to these. And this, by the way, this in no way represents all of the targets that they hit. This just gives you a pretty good sense for where they were going. But it's not an individual, it doesn't match up to these 164 targets, or obviously the rounds, number of rounds fired. Major General Leonard Giroux, who was in charge of the 5th Corps landing at Omaha after the invasion, said, "Thank God for the U.S. Navy." Bradley, who was in charge of all of the our American forces landing, as I said, at Omaha, Utah, and the airborne, said that the Navy saved our hides.
I bet he didn't say hides.
It was in his memoir.
Yeah, well, he had an editor.
Yeah. All right. That's it, folks. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dave, I want to let the audience know how much time you have spent researching this. This was in anticipation of putting together a book,
Yes.
and you spent at least 2 years researching, and things haven't always gone as smoothly as the authors would like.
Yeah.
Would you spend a couple minutes talking about some of the obstacles, not necessarily the Belgian gates or the hedgehogs, but the obstacles that you have run into in your project here, trying to put together a book about this?
Sure. So COVID was still somewhat of an issue when I was kind of getting started on this thing. And I have, even though I've done a lot of research, I actually haven't ever gone to the National Archives in person to do the research. So I found people that actually specialize in doing that. After contacting the National Archives, they said, yeah, actually we have people who will come to the archives and do the research for you. And interestingly enough, you can actually sort of pick the area that you're interested in, topic, and say, this is what I'm interested in, and they'll actually say, here are the people who actually do that kind of research. So I had narrowed it down to a couple of people that I found that looked pretty interesting in that regard, and one of them was a lady who I called up, and literally when I called her up, I said, I mean, this is the kind of research that I'm doing, be interested in maybe talking to you about this. I said, how familiar are you, as an example, you remember the resistance nests? So 60 to 73 resistance nests. I said, just as an example, because I've been there, and I kind of wanted to say, so what do you know about resistance nest number 60? She said, well, actually, as it turns out, I'm in France right now, and I was down there visiting yesterday. So I said, you're hired. So I ended up actually communicating with her. It's amazing what you can get done on a remote basis. The book that I wrote, my editor was back in New York. I did the entire edit, multiple edits, all remotely. Never met the guy in person. So anyway, I started communicating with, or I'd put together by then a lot of information about what specifically I wanted her to start looking for, and gave her that list. And so she went to the National Archives, on my behalf, and started doing the research that I needed. And that helped a lot in terms of getting like those firing totals that you saw on that spreadsheet that showed the 9 destroyers, where they were at. And I was able to get ship's logs, sort of the equivalent of an after-action report for you Army guys, that showed, and one of the things that is really beneficial from the Navy's perspective when you're dealing with something like this is they actually have somebody who's writing down what are we firing on and when, so we have a really accurate time log of when these shots are taking place, as opposed to guys in the Army. After-action reports, correct me if I'm wrong if any of you guys have written these, but typically they're written sometime after the event's taken place. Plus, if you're in combat, it's not like, oh, let's see, I'm firing on this at 9:02 in the morning, right? And so your memory, at least in terms of the time log, is not going to be nearly as sharp as it is relative to what the Navy is when they've got people there writing this stuff down as it's taking place. So it was really valuable in that regard. So that was kind of a lot of the stuff, and I did find Army as well. So I got these logs from the Navy, got some Army after-action reports as well. One of the biggest obstacles, you remember, and I didn't highlight it that much other than highlighting it red, when I was showing you what it's supposed to look like between the shore fire control party and so operating between them and the Navy, and you had this incredible log of all these things taking place and the adjustments of fire. When I showed you that 6-digit code that I highlighted in red, those were the coordinates that are supposed to be on this map. This infamous map, not this one, but the one that actually has those numbers on it, I have yet to be able to find anybody who can actually get me a copy of that map that has all those coordinates across here in this. I found one for over here for Sword, Juno, and Gold, but I cannot find one for Omaha. The reason I wanted that, and it's actually less important than what I originally thought, but the reason I wanted that is that those coordinates would literally allow me, if I had that across the length and breadth of Omaha, to see the battle move inland. Are you following me? In other words, I could actually see those coordinates, where they're firing and how the movement takes place as those shots are happening. But I could never find that map. And I don't have the detail because the shore fire control parties got taken out or just had fouled radios across most of Omaha. Really the only place that I could really chart the battle moving inland would be on Point de Hoc, where I have all that data. But I've literally come across that reference, meaning those 6-digit coordinators, in hundreds and hundreds of the documents that I've looked at so far. So it's really common. So why that map is so elusive,
David,
I don't know.
Since that whole area falls under NATO, we had topographic maps for everything.
Okay.
German border all the way back to Belgium.
Uh-huh.
And I would almost think you could probably find a military topographic map for Normandy. It'd be current, but the number sequence there
Might still be the same. You know, that'd be interesting. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if that's the case.
Does anybody know if they changed the grid system, like between Vietnam and World War II?
That I don't. But,
They may have gone from feet to meters.
well, it's always meters.
Always meters, okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the photo that you showed of, excuse me, Omaha Beach, it was clear that there were a lot of clefts there, and
Yeah.
it was hard to tell if they had many draws, but once they got the tanks ashore, how difficult was it to get them inland through those cliffs, or, you know, between the cliffs?
So you couldn't do that, and because like I say, they were pretty rudiment, I think with one exception. Clint, maybe you know? Seemed to me like of the 5 draws, there was only one that really was capable of doing much in the form of
Deerfield draw.
vehicular traffic right off the bat. So we had I love the combat engineers, had combat engineers that would come in right away after that with bulldozers and the like, and they would start creating literally roads that would allow us to get our heavy equipment inland. Because initially, most of those draws were not capable of supporting that. But that still was the way inland. And there was a road that runs pretty much parallel to the beach that's not very far beyond the bluffs. Yeah, in the back?
I'm pretty impressed by the map that you made up here.
Yeah.
It looked very detailed from where I'm sitting. How much time did it take you to do that?
Oh.
And how did you do it?
A long, I didn't time myself, but it took a long time to do that. And so it's based on those reports that I got from the National Archives, yes, and some other documents or things that have been written by other people that help me place some of the locations as well, but hours and hours.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
So you had those destroyer logs, firing logs. And in those logs, does it say what their position was along that 5-mile crescent beach?
I didn't see anything that said that.
So we don't.
All I can go by is what they were firing on. And it's not like they had to be immediately in front of it. So in other words, they could have been over here, and because I looked up just this morning, because it's been a while since I looked at that. Those 5-inch guns can reach out as far as almost 10 miles, 15,000 meters. So, I mean, I could be over here, and if all of a sudden I spot, now realistically with your binoculars, especially when I'm having to remember again, fire on targets of opportunity, it's probably going to be mostly straight on, but I certainly have the range to reach across, so you wouldn't have to necessarily be there. But probably that was the case. And so in most cases, what you would think is, yeah, these shots as an example by, I'll take McCook, because you see a lot of yellow here and here. Realistically, it was probably, but no, I don't have the exact coordinates. I don't remember seeing that ever specified in those logs.
They wouldn't even know where they were exactly, other than off a certain beach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, I mean, just thinking at it out loud, and I'm not a Navy veteran, I wouldn't think it would be that important. It's hitting the target and not where I'm at any given point in time. Yeah, I think I saw, oh, okay, yes, sir.
You might mention that this chart is in the Civil War room.
Yes. No, well, no, it's actually in where the D-Day thing is. Yeah, no, I made a copy of this so that they can include it in the exhibit.
Below it. So if you want to go look at that, it's right over there.
Yes, it is. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if in your extensive research you came across anything about a 6th landing beach, codenamed Fox, on the extreme left of the Union line, the Allied line.
So the extreme left would be over here, Port in Benson and Gold.
Yeah, it would have been north and east of that, right along the coast.
Yeah, this is the coastline right here. No, I will say that there were, as you can see, huge numbers, even though literally it's sort of on the edge beyond or where we were sending in troops. Because Fox Red is the last beach for Omaha. We fired huge numbers of rounds over in this area of Port in Benson. In fact, it's making me wonder, albeit I never did any research on it yet, because Gold is a British beach, if they shouldn't have been firing on some of these targets over here, because we fired a lot on Port in Benson. I'm sorry?
It was codenamed Fox, and it was another British landing site.
Oh, it was British.
It was British.
Okay.
Do you know anything about that?
I don't.
Okay, I ran across it one time when I was on the internet.
Okay. There were gaps rightfully so probably, to make sure that there were friendly fire incidents again. There were gaps between each one of the invasion beaches because they had to be linked up afterward. But my guess is that the reason, probably, again, maybe some of you guys, because I'm not a vet, probably know this, is to avoid friendly fire incidents. If you were literally having them come across, if you didn't have some gap in between, especially if you're talking about British, Canadian, and American, and you're not controlling all of those things simultaneously, you probably don't, you want to have gaps in between so that there's no friendly fire incidents. Yes, ma'am.
Have you looked to see, are there deck logs available for those destroyers?
Yeah, so that is what I'm relying on a lot in terms of the detail that I've given.
I know I've done a lot of looking at deck logs for Vietnam ships. They made a notation about every 4 hours. Were they that detailed?
Yeah, that's how I was, like for instance, that Point to Hawk example that I gave you, literally almost sort of minute by minute chronology that went on from 7:30 in the morning to about 2100, which would be 9.
I thought that was artillery fire.
It is, but that's coming from,
From the deck logs?
yeah, well, from their firing log, yeah.
Okay, because I thought deck logs were different from firing logs.
Well, my concentration was just on the firing log.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is maybe the deck logs would give you some more information.
About the location? Could be.
And I'm assuming that I'm not the only one that can say this, but my dad was there on D-Day.
Oh, he was?
And he was Navy, and he was on the USS Ancon, which was the command ship. And he was a machinist mate, but apparently not too long before D-Day, they suddenly had a need for some last-minute maps. And they went looking through the ship for somebody that could draw maps. And my dad was a sign painter in real life. So they found him and they locked him in the Admiral's cabin to do the maps until he was done.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah, I wish I knew more about what he was doing that day, but like so many of them have been talked about.
You didn't see
Yeah.
any of those, did you?
No, they were, I don't think they probably searched it before he left.
I've got an easy one, if you know the answer, David,
Okay.
chime in, but are there any Navy black shoes in here that can explain something about naval artillery? In the designation of the guns, they say 5-inch
38 caliber.
38.
Uh-huh.
38 caliber.
Well, 5 inches the caliber. The shell is 5 inches in diameter.
But they call it the 38 caliber. And I don't really understand.
I think it describes some other dimension on the cannon. You know, Jim?
Yes, 38 caliber means the length of the gun is you multiply 5 times 38, and that is the length of the gun. So that's,
Okay.
5 times 38?
yes.
Oh, okay.
And that gives you the length of the barrel from the muzzle to the receiver.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how they designate that.
I knew somebody would know. Not some Army guy.
Air Force.
In the Pacific, when they were invading a number of those islands,
Yeah.
they used 8-inch guns from heavy cruisers, they used 16-inch guns from battleships.
Right.
I noticed here, it was mostly just 5-inch guns.
Correct.
Well, on
From
the destroyers.
destroyers.
On the destroyers.
Is there any particular reason they didn't use heavier guns here?
Well, probably the draft,
The
they
recoil,
probably I mean, they couldn't get within, I mean, they were actually visually sighting the targets from the ships. You have to be pretty close to the beach.
You were very
And
close.
cruisers draw a lot more than 35 feet, so
And
they
the-
couldn't get into.
And likewise with the battleships. Now,
Bigger caliber.
the Texas was called on briefly to fire a few shots on Point to Hawk, but not a lot. The battleships and cruisers actually provided more fire support actually in the days following the invasion. And one of the really interesting examples that I came across on the Texas was that the Germans figured out how far they could actually fire from where they were out in the water, how far inland they could fire. And so they ultimately started moving their infantry and material, tanks, etc., beyond that point. Well, apparently the Texas, somebody managed to figure that out on the Allied side, so they actually flooded part of one side of the ship to the point where they could tip the ship.
Oh, my.
So that the guns could fire. Now, naval guns, by comparison to howitzers, which is mostly what the Army uses, howitzers fire like this, just like mortars. They lob shots, and the reason is that the terrain undulates a lot, right? So I can even literally fire on the other side of the hill because I can do that. Does that make sense?
That's called indirect fire.
Yes. Naval guns they're firing flat for the most part. Yes.
They do both.
Huh?
They do both.
They,
They do indirect, but they also do direct.
well, but because it's a flatter round to begin with, in terms of the way
The
that,
main enemy is a ship. That's a flat shot.
right. Albeit they were used very heavily in terms of fire support here and other places during World War II. Anyway, so they tipped the ship, literally, so that they could fire, the point behind that story, fire further inland and hit those German defenses, which I thought was incredibly creative. And
All the sailors run over to the port side.
I think it probably took a little more than that, but yes. Thought that was a great story. I think I saw another question or two somewhere. Oh,
I just wanted to note, in the Pacific, particularly as we moved up the Solomon Island chain, every time we made another landing, it was the destroyers which provided the critical support for the landing force. And part of that is we'd run out of cruisers by then, who'd been sunk or shot up. And again, the biggest benefit for the destroyers, they could get close to shore, it could fire a whole different range of artillery things. And by the time we did the Normandy landing, the Army and the Navy had worked together quite often to provide that sort of support. In fact, my father's destroyer was involved in doing exactly that on New Georgia Island. The only problem back then, because the area was so restricted, you often did take return fire from the Japanese. So.
Yep. Very cool. Any others? Yes, sir.
I'm surprised that there were any resistance nests left by nightfall.
Well,
Most of them gone.
taken out of commission. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but that didn't mean that there weren't, so that it wasn't just a matter of firing on the resistance nests. If you remember kind of looking down those incredible lists that we saw, so it was still machine guns. It was still Germans in different positions beyond, in other words, not just in those resistance nests that we were having to take out. And probably in most cases, yeah, certainly by the time you're talking, 2200, yes, further inland. Yeah. I mean, they could fire, they had the range to fire all the way into those towns. Remember, I was saying, in many cases, they actually went after churches and church steeples that were actually in those 5 towns that were up those draws. So those would have been miles inland. Yeah. Yeah.
Just having read about this, for years and years in various ways, it seems to me that those cliffs were just such a big target, and I was always puzzled by why they were not the target of naval artillery, I guess in this case, referencing a flat shot, and just deteriorate the cliff itself so that maybe whatever's on top of it, I don't know, it was just puzzling to me.
So,
There were a lot of slips.
so remember the pre-invasion bombardment only lasted 40 minutes. And you immediately had dust and smoke and fire, smoke from fire or whatever, that was obscuring those targets. There had been, all those had been pre-identified. Remember, again, going back to firing logs, you were seeing like target 88 or something as an example. They had been pre-designated, but once that started kicking up, the other thing is, remember, somebody mentioned earlier on or whatever, and this is somewhat conjecture, I haven't seen this specifically, but that we had the deception plan to convince them we're obviously going to fire over there. So just as an example, you were talking about in the Pacific as an example, Iwo Jima got 3 days worth of pre-invasion bombardment, naval bomb, and it still wasn't enough, by the way, but 3 days worth. Well, you could do that in Iwo Jima. I can't park for 3 days off of Normandy when my deception plan is saying the invasion is up here at the Pas de Calais. I can't park here for 3 days and provide naval bombardment to take out those heavy positions.
Well, you're still worried about German submarines. I mean,
Yeah, well, we had reasonably good control over the Atlantic, and we actually didn't lose any ships during the invasion to submarine. We did lose a few to mines, including one destroyer off of Utah that sank. I can't think of the name of it, Corey or something like that, maybe. Anyway, but we didn't lose any to that. But that would be, I think, the reason why you didn't see a prolonged pre-invasion bombardment by heavy, because we did have, like I said, 2 battleships, the Arkansas and the Texas, as well as 3 cruisers that could have hit those targets a lot harder. But didn't, because I think more than anything else, they simply couldn't have them out there that long.
Well, and your deception goes away.
Well, and by the way, we're landing at 6:30, which is just barely past dawn. So all of that would have had to be taking place if you were going to do a more prolonged one than 40 minutes in the dark. Yes, sir.
What size of guns were in those concrete pillboxes?
Well, they weren't all the same, all the way from 75 to 88, and then some were as big as 150 millimeters.
150?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
they had 155.
May have been.
A 5-inch round is about 127 millimeters, right? So that wasn't that big a gun. Anyway.
No, well, you weren't having to completely destroy those huge bunkers. What you were really doing is saturating the area. They obviously had port openings for the guns to be firing at. All you had to do is, and I'm not saying that this was a simple thing, and to me it's incredible that they could be that accurate. I'm always amazed, frankly, at the accuracy. I've managed once upon a time to actually interview a couple of guys who were on destroyers during World War II. And it's incredible when you consider that the ship is moving, they may be firing at a moving target, as well as how accurate, especially when you consider, they didn't have computers back then. Now they did have these things, I actually have a picture of one somewhere, I didn't bring it for this, but it was about the size, about like this, sort of like a half refrigerator. And there were a couple, 2 or 3 guys who were being on this thing, and they would be making adjustments on this, and it would take into consideration all kinds of different things to determine how to fire that shot and hit that target. But going back to the point I was making, they could literally hit it with enough rounds that they could get some through those openings that the Germans were firing from, and either kill the crew, hit a munitions magazine maybe in there that it would explode, etc. And that's how ultimately these things were taken out.
Wasn't there one destroyer that actually beached itself knowing that?
Hold on just a second. Somebody's trying to call me. Let me shut my phone off completely. There we go. I'm sorry. Go ahead and ask your question.
I read that there was one destroyer that beached itself knowing that the tide was going to come in and they would be able to pull back.
Not in this case.
Okay.
No. Like I say, some of them got in incredibly close. It seemed to me like one of the ones that I saw actually indicated as close as 300 yards. So, I mean, you're talking point blank range practically. 500 to 1,000 yards was kind of where an awful lot of these guys were cruising, and they only had 12 to 18 feet of water underneath them. So it was getting to be kind of risky, but it's like, oh, we've got to do this in order to be successful. We're not going to get off the beach if we don't do this. Yes, sir.
We're talking about that half refrigerator analog computers.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
On the battleship Missouri, if you can tour it today.
I've actually been on it. It's really cool. Absolutely recommend it.
That analog computer they used to fire the big, I think it was 16.
16 on the Missouri.
It's the same as they had in World War II. And I asked the question when I was touring, when they recommissioned the battleship in the 80s, I think, why didn't they upgrade it? He says they couldn't make it better.
They couldn't improve it. I ran into a friend of mine, my former CPA actually, who was on a destroyer during the Vietnam War. And we got into this discussion as well. And he said, they actually apparently tempted to do some computerization type of upgrade to it, and found the same thing, that frankly, the old system works better. So we're going to use that. I mean, it really was good. Yeah. So, yes.
I've almost forgotten what I was going to ask you. Oh, I'm reading the book Eisenhower and War and Peace.
Oh.
No expert on either at all. But when you mentioned the 40 minutes, the book said, I got it, remembering it right, that they recognized that not doing it, not bombarding for 4 hours instead of the 40 minutes, there was a reason, like they didn't think it was heavily fortified or something, and afterwards they thought, we really should have bombed it for longer. And then one thing I forgot to mention, which is just almost irrelevant, but there's a ferry line that goes from Groton, Connecticut to the outer end of Long Island. And one of the ships that they have is one of the landing craft for D-Day. It's like only one of 3 that's still afloat and still in service. And they remodeled the up top into a lounge, and it's all around it. It's got big pictures of D-Day. It's just amazing taking that cruise and looking at the pictures and realizing you're on the same ship that those guys were on before they landed.
Where is that, did you say?
It goes from Orient Point on Long Island to Groton, Connecticut.
Okay.
It's about an hour and a half.
Very cool.
That's cool. Well, David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Again.
You're welcome.
I know you have one.
Oh.
But anyway, in case you don't.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And also, David's book's up here, and it's a fantastic book. I read it. If you want to kind of get a good idea of what went on during the last 140 days of World War II in the Pacific, that's a marvelous book. So come visit, look at our exhibit upstairs as well.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
If I Google National Archives, would I be able to reach them and get in touch with one of those researchers?